Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Hi, everybody. I'm Claudia Reuter. I am the Executive Director, Engineering Innovation, and Director of the Roberts Innovation Fund for Yale Engineering. And I'm so delighted that we have so many amazing people here in the room today. We've got an incredible tech track here at the Yale Innovation Summit. Thanks to, in large part, to our colleagues across Yale Ventures and Yale Engineering who have made this possible. But if you stay with us for the day, I think you'll be really inspired by the people and experiences you're about to hear from. We kick off here with the panel you're about to hear from, focused on arts and technology, followed by a really interesting conversation with a prolific investor, Andy Tang. Followed by the Roberts Innovation Fund Showcase, which gives you an opportunity to actually hear from our 10 newest Roberts awardees who are really working at the edge of innovation here in Yale Engineering, and you'll get to hear exactly what that sounds like. And then we'll break, and you can participate in lunch and e-posters, and then the entire tech track will actually move to the Zhang Auditorium, where you'll hear from Dean Brock and Dan O'Keefe, who's with the DECD, followed by a panel on cloud computing, which should be really interesting with some folks from Google and Amazon and 2048, followed by a really interesting, thoughtful conversation with Tracy, the DOC Curry, who was the co-founder of Death Row Records and actually is working on leveraging AI to reclaim his voice. So it's an exciting day ahead and more to come tomorrow, but I'd like to really jump in and start by introducing our esteemed panel today. And I'll turn it over to Rachel Fine, who's moderating, who is the Executive Director of the Schwartzman Center here at Yale University, where she's leading all efforts and really is doing quite a bit in the world of theater and incubation, and there's just quite a bit to learn from Rachel's experience. So Rachel, thank you for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. I don't think this is on. Maybe I have to press a button. I'm actually part of the arts track, not the technology track. Well, welcome to the Yale Innovation Summit, and welcome to Where Art Meets Innovation, exploring the intersection of arts, technology, and media. This panel will explore how creative expression and cutting-edge innovation are shaping new industries, experiences, and opportunities in an era where the lines among art, technology, and media are increasingly blurred. I'm Rachel Fine, as you just learned. I'm the Executive Director of the Yale Schwartzman Center, and we opened on November 5th, 2022. So we've actually just finished our third season of programming and activities and events at the Schwartzman Center. And I am, of course, delighted to serve as moderator and facilitator of this timely discussion. Before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to take a moment to recognize Yale Ventures and to thank my colleagues Josh Gabal and Francis Pollock for integrating the arts track into the Innovation Summit for the third year in a row. If you work in the arts, then you probably know that it's not often conferences of this sort value the arts alongside biotech, climate, all of the things that are also being carefully considered at this conference. So I'm deeply grateful for them that the arts are elevated as a part of the subjects covered at this conference. So here with me are our panelists, Julie Dorsey, Frederick W. Meineke Professor of Computer Science and founder and chief scientist at Mental Canvas. Eastin, I'm going to say Rossell. Eastin Rossell, Venture Director at Hearstlab, and Lance Wirtz, co-founder of the Indistinguishable from Magic Techstars 22. In a moment, I'm going to ask you your first question, but first I want to just give a brief overview of what the Schwartzman Center does, and I also want to invite you while you're on campus to go over, it's actually just around the corner by Beinecke Library. It is open, and we have many exhibits up right now. But I think what Steve Schwartzman and many others at Yale had in mind more than anything else was Yale's first Center for Community. Now, it comes in many different shapes and sizes through the community building, through the Schwartzman Center. We are an arts and culture center. We are a hospitality center with many dining platforms. We are a student center. We are a wellness center. And all of that goes on in 125,000 square feet. It is a historic building that was renovated and repurposed to facilitate this community building. And I also like to say joy building. It's a very happy place on this campus with all of this activity going on and so much community connection. In the arts space and in the technology space, we have a number of different multifaceted, multi-genre performance spaces. They all have many uses. So if you happen to be in the Schwartzman Center today, I don't know that Commons is open, but for 100 years, Commons served as a dining hall. Now it's sort of an everything hall. It does continue to be a dining hall for everybody, students, undergraduate, graduate, faculty, staff, and also members of the New Haven community and beyond. Anyone can come in and have a meal there. And that's true of all the dining platforms in the space. And our bar, we have the only sanctioned bar on campus. But when it's not a dining hall, it is a performance and event space. And if you actually look up, you'll see that all the infrastructure is there to accommodate music, theater, and dance, and the acoustics throughout the building were redone to accommodate all different types of music. The other thing I want to say about it that makes it very unusual in a bustling space is that no admission is required. So there is no barrier, no financial barrier to entry, and it's maybe, in my opinion, the greatest gift that the Schwartzman Center could have given this community. So it doesn't matter if you're seeing Renee Fleming or Corinne Bailey Ray or an innovative artist, it is free. You just have to register for a ticket. And then every space is equipped with formidable technology. So we're able to introduce all different kinds of art forms, multidisciplinary work. We work across departments and schools at Yale, but we also work very closely with members of the arts and culture community of New Haven. So anyway, we are doing Copenhagen tomorrow night, the play, in our space called the Dome. And that is our offering with the Yale Innovation Summit as part of this conference. So I invite you over, and that's just a little background on the Schwartzman Center. But let me introduce our panelists and just give your brief introduction, maybe 1 to 2 minutes, in terms of what you do at your organization. So Julie, why don't we start with you?
Okay. I think this
I'm an expert.
Yeah. Okay, I'm a faculty member in the computer science department at Yale, and I also have a background in architecture. And most of my work in computer science is motivated by problems in architecture, like how materials look in different kinds of lighting conditions, rendering gigantic environments, and things like that. But I'm going to just talk just for a minute about a spin-out called Mental Canvas, which I started in my lab and then commercialized. And I think what's interesting about it is it started just being funded by traditional National Science Foundation grants. But what it made it special is that I also wrote in architecture students into the grant so that they were an integral part of the development of the initial prototypes and then eventually into the spin out. So Mental Canvas is really about the future of drawing on computers. Here we go. And basically drawing is a bedrock of creativity. It's been around for thousands of years and it's used for all kinds of things like ideation, presentations, and so on. What's interesting about it is drawing on a computer isn't that different than drawing was during the Renaissance. And so Mental Canvas is really about taking drawing to a place it's never been. So our goal is really to elevate the drawing, empower artists, and make drawing as fluid a form of communication as text, video, and photography are. So basically, we're not taking drawings and turning it into CAD, we're actually making the drawing a new form of graphical media. We've added a whole bunch of new capabilities to what you can draw, and it really changes how you think about a drawing. So mental canvas is used in applications like architectural design by designers such as shop architects or sneaker designers at Nike. It's also used for graphic novels. This is a production from Amazon. And things like promotion of athletes. This is an example of some sports applications and media distribution. Okay, that's it for me. And one of the things I want to say is our investors include EQT, Microsoft, and also Hearstlab, which is a nice segue to Eastin, Rossell, which is his focus.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you for having me. I'm Eastin Rossell. I'm the venture director at Hearstlab. I've been at the lab for 3.5 years now, and I will say Mental Canvas does predate me, so that was actually one of my first previews of seeing it in action. And I feel like my background is actually surprisingly relevant. It's usually not relevant to the panel, but I've always been in buy-side investing, but I actually graduated school thinking I was going to be a writer. That was my big plan. Unfortunately, it was not paying when I graduated, so I ended up, and I wasn't very good. I ended up taking a job at a startup hedge fund where I worked on their quantitative models, and then I moved more into stock picking. And then after that, I moved into middle market private equity, which is as evil as it sounds, primarily doing turnarounds on industrial businesses. And then actually COVID hit, and I wanted to do work that I thought was still interesting, but truthfully more meaningful. And so I actually found Hearstlab. So Hearstlab is actually corporate venture. It's a part of Hearst Corporation, again, quite pertinent. Hearst is a very large media company. And our goal at Hearstlab is to fund the next amazing generation of female founders. So for us, that means we only look for female CEOs. We're investing in very early stage businesses, so pre-seed, seed, Series A stage. So think usually under $1 million in revenue. And then we work really closely with those companies for at least a year post-investment, if not longer, generally trying to connect them to the broader efforts at Hearst Corporate. So about half of my day is spent looking for our new investment. So I'm primarily looking through pitch decks, trying to discover what our next great investment might be. And then the other half of my time, my favorite part, is spending time with the founders, trying to give what little advice I have to offer to help them build their startups. So I bring a background primarily in financials, but again, I think my liberal arts background was really impactful, particularly when thinking about analyzing businesses. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit more. And I'll turn it over to Lance, who I can't invest in, unfortunately.
Hi everyone, I'm Lance Chantiles. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Indistinguishable from Magic. We go by If Magic. For short, I was Yale class of 2019. Prior to Yale, I studied professionally as a ballet dancer and also was fortunate enough to act professionally on Broadway film and television, but always sort of wanted to study the arts and the intersection of technology and the arts. So at Yale, I double majored in mechanical engineering and film and media studies, and a lot of the work I did here as an undergrad sort of influenced the work that we're doing at If Magic. We're building a no-code physical computing platform, so making it a lot easier to build sensor-connected experiences. So that can be as simple as a home automation to more advanced factory monitoring, or where we're really focused is within the experiential sector. So enabling artists, designers to create more immersive, interactive experiences and really trying to democratize that tech, which is normally hours spent wiring, soldering, doing embedded programming, and really making it faster and easier for those with the technical background, but then also opening up to this much wider sort of artistic audience.
I'm wondering if we can just probe a little deeper on that, because I'm sure you are all aware that the immersive experience is something that is very, very trendy right now. So first of all, could you talk a little bit about what an immersive experience it is and how art and technology come together, and maybe how your platform facilitates that? And maybe you can give an example. I mean, I think it was Blue down in Florida.
Yes.
That really brought high-level, very visible artists together with technology, and in a space where you are fully immersed in sound and in visuals and whatnot.
Absolutely. So you have it's a really wide spectrum of immersive experiences. So on the one end, you have sort of small pop-ups and installations, and at the other end, you have full spaces that have been dedicated to create these immersive exhibits. So it can range from full-scale projection mapping. A lot of people might be familiar with the sort of projection mapping Van Gogh experiences, but then you also have almost these real-life video games where you can actually become these characters that where you're interacting with video games within the space, actors, sort of really being able to live out a fantasy in many ways. You have the Disneys and Universals, but as technology is becoming easier to use and faster, you're also noticing a lot more start to pop up. So you also have this mix of industry as well with things like immersive retail. Example, just actually got back from the World Experience Summit in London, where it was hosted was at this place called Phantom Peak, which is this sort of 30,000 square foot space. It's supposed to look like a old mining town. And as you go through it, it's sort of like an escape room where, you're doing these puzzles, solving them, but really trying to make them almost this wish fulfillment case. So the things that you will see in a movie that you can never really live out, actually being able to do them within real life. And sort of where our platform comes in, a lot of times you want to not break the creative flow. So you might have this idea and then, test it out with people or are doing it live. And most of the time, you have to sort of have this large timeline and budget because there's so much technical innovation that has to go into it. And so a lot of times you do it, then you get into the space and you're like, well, this isn't really working, but we can't do anything about it. And so what we really want to do is allow you to sort of build at the speed at which you're thinking about doing these things. So you can test things out on the fly. You can do things that normally you would have to say, well, this will just take too long. So to really level up what that next stage of technology will be. And also enabling artists that normally wouldn't have these amazing ideas, but not necessarily have the technical background to enable them. They have these amazing ideas. Like we just had a musician at the Getty Museum have this like inflatable that was bounced through the crowd, and it changed the music and visuals on stage live, which we'd have never thought about when we started this off. But just they have these amazing things, and to be able to enable them has been very fulfilling.
Great, thank you. So Julie, I'm curious to know how you identified the need for mental canvas, and then I would love to know from Eastin why her pitch deck was successful.
So in computer graphics, which is my main area, there's been just a ton of work in 2D graphics and a ton of work in 3D graphics. And because I come from an architecture background and I draw a lot and I really value the role of drawing in ideation and thinking things through, it occurred to me that there are these 2D systems and 3D systems, but drawing has kind of been lost. It just hasn't moved from 2D. It hasn't really changed for thousands of years. And unlike things like music, which have been fundamentally transformed by computers. So I took this on as a kind of high-risk project, which is the perfect thing for a research lab at Yale. Not really knowing where it was going to go, and sort of trying out some initial ideas and then seeing, this really has potential. And at the time we were actually drawing with a mouse, and I started to invest in more, like tablets were starting to come online and become ubiquitous. So it was like the perfect timing to think about how you could reimagine what drawing is today.
And Eastin?
Sure. So I did not actually view Julie's pitch deck. It was a little before me, so I'm going to speculate wildly with the information I have. And so I think just in my interactions with Julie, there's a couple of things that we hope for, look for when we're considering investing in a startup. And one of the things that's, I would say, exceedingly rare is to have technology that's, I would say, truly novel and defensible. And in Julie's case, Mental Canvas, I imagine there's IP behind it. And then I think one of the most important factors is when you're thinking about investing in a company at an early stage, there's generally one person, maybe two founders. It sounds like Julie also had an army of architecture students, but they don't count. And so her expertise at this stage matters more than anything, and you want a founder that's really obsessed with the problem. And so if I were looking at her pitch deck, one of the first things I would have done is rip up her LinkedIn profile, read everything she's ever written if she has, and try to sort of kind of read between the lines of, does this founder actually understand what she's building? Does she have the expertise to build it better than anyone else? And so I think that's probably the first thing I would have honed in on. And then the second piece is when we think about investing, particularly at Hearst, one of the things that we really do is try to bring in the people who work within Hearst. There's 20,000 employees. Hearst is, I think, the largest private company in New York. It is silently much larger than one might expect. And so we would want to know that the startup was actually able to work with Hearst. And so Hearst is an old media company. They have magazines, they have newspapers, they have TV stations. And so they're constantly thinking about how do we address our audience in this modern age when tablets are coming up, when content is essentially free and distribution is certainly free. And so we would have been looking for novel ways to kind of speak to our audience. So I believe you partnered with, I want to say SF Cron to kind of visualize some of the articles in the magazines. Someone told me the article was about dead bodies at the bottom of Lake Tahoe. And I was like, oh, I got to read that.
It's quite a visualization.
Yeah, I bet. So I think that's what we'd have honed in on.
Yeah, and just a little side note, I just want to suggest that Hearst, William Randolph Hearst, really put the architect Julia Morgan on the map. So if you're familiar with Hearst Castle, it is a magnificent Julia Morgan building. And how did you two come together? So what was the process by which you either discovered Hearst or vice versa?
Julie?
So because Mental Canvas is basically creating a new form of media, Hearst was an obvious partner. But I, kind of reached out actually to Eve Burton, initially the chief legal officer and the founder of Hearstlab, and started a conversation and then went through a series of pitches. And as Eastin said, one of the things that's really important is connecting to some Hearst companies, so that you're not, that's one of the real benefits of Hearstlab is the opportunity to partner with their huge array of companies.
So I want to dive a little bit deeper into your backgrounds, and I know when we had our preliminary talk, we discussed at length liberal arts education and arts education. I know, Lance, you were a very serious dancer, and did you say you were on Broadway? Well, we'd all like to know what you were doing on Broadway. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that background. I know I was a very serious concert pianist. My world was actually very siloed. Technology was nowhere near what I was doing. But I can tell you the majority of people that I studied with growing up, including in college, did not go into music in the long run. And I think we're often told, oh, you can't make a living, you can't do this, you can't do that. But I think we all feel that it's absolutely critical to have a liberal arts background, and actually could be very beneficial in the technology world or beyond.
Absolutely. So, just with Yale particularly, I think one of the great things is the fact that the engineering school and the sciences are all integrated together. When I was applying, people were like, well, why aren't you just going to something that's very specific for engineering? And it was because of that interdisciplinary study. And I think actually during the orientation, they said the geographic location of the engineering school is between the humanities and the sciences. And so you have that nice piece of it as well. But with the arts, I would say it's really, the discipline that comes with it and having that training. And I think always saw these elements of how technology has raised the bar within the arts and how you could also have it be a vehicle to bring the arts to a much wider audience there. And then really started to see, there's the computing and the arts major at Yale and was really inspired by that. And, sort of being involved in these sort of large-scale performances. When I was younger, I was in The Miracle Worker on Broadway, which is the story of Helen Keller, and sort of seeing, it was in the round at Circle in the Square, and seeing the technology that was going into it, where they had these, sets that were getting raised and lowered from this, I was just a little kid, so I was looking around like, this is some of the coolest stuff I've ever seen. And I think it was at that point where I'm like, okay, how can these things start to be integrated and how can they come together? And then sort of just having the facilities at Yale to start to explore those passions and have that encouragement. You have the Center for Collaborative Arts and Media, Center for Engineering, Innovation, and Design, Sci-City, where they're really sort of saying, okay, how can you start, really encouraging students' ideas and how can they be pushed forward?
Great, thank you. And what about you? I know you mentioned creative writing, but how did that ultimately lead to where you are and being good at what you do?
I think, yeah, I would like to think I'm good at what I do. I'm not sure I had a direct path from English to investing, but when I think about, I always call investing sort of a game of telephone. So you can imagine I might meet Julie or Lance and I get very excited about their startup. And then I've got to go communicate to my boss what I'm excited about that startup. And I just met them. I talked to them for 30 minutes. They've also communicated what's interesting about their startup. Then my boss communicates to my boss. And then we communicate amongst Hearst what's interesting. And so when I think about the value of a liberal arts degree for both investors and founders, I think it does come back a lot to rhetoric and also being logical and presenting something in a way that people can follow. If you think about a pre-seed or seed stage business, Julie's business would be a little bit different, but generally they are not the same in 2 years. They become something completely different because they need to pivot for the market. And so, part of being a founder is being able to think laterally or being able to assess a situation critically and change based on new information. And so it's not that the sciences are necessarily rigid, but there's usually one correct answer. In English, there are billions of correct answers. But usually none of them are correct. You're writing a paper trying to explain why someone made a metaphor that no one's sure that writer even meant to write. And so I think about every day when I write these investment memos, I'm essentially just trying to convince my bosses the same way I used to convince my English teachers that I totally understood what this book was about. But one of the other things that I don't want to get lost is a lot of female founders, they really do come from, I would say, liberal arts backgrounds. And I think one of the biggest pieces when you're just going into that initial intro call with a founder is you really want to be excited and inspired by their idea. You want to know that they're in it for the long haul. You want to believe them. You want to know, most importantly, they're going to go out there and get other investors to believe in them. And then they're going to be able to attract the kind of talent that they'll absolutely need to help them build the business. And what I've really seen, it's not always true. Certainly technical founders are quite successful as well. But my favorite founders tend to be the women from marketing and PR. They can convince me in the first five. Oh, thank you. Okay, we got some marketing ladies. They can convince me in 5 minutes, right or wrong. But I think it really does come back to sort of how well do you speak, how well do you present, how well do you inspire.
And before I turn to you, Julie, I'm just wondering, Eastin, if you're seeing a big shift in new inventions being developed where both arts and technology are being utilized.
Let's see, I joined Hearstlab basically in 2021, and if you're familiar with venture markets, the money spigot was on. Interest rates were low. Everything was getting invested in. I was like, this is so easy. And then I was like, I don't know what people are complaining about. And then, the economy changed. They raised interest rates. Money was no longer free. And I was like, oh, this is difficult. This is really hard. And so that was kind of the first big shift. It was literally a change in markets and kind of capital dried up. But what we're really seeing now, and everyone's aware of it, is just this advent of Gen AI and the absolute uncertainty that comes with it. And so there's so many different pieces I could talk about, truthfully, with sort of how it's changing media. It's happening at Hearst. You can imagine Hearst is thinking, what do we do about content when Gen AI can pump it out this quickly? What do we do with our writers? How do we take care of our business? I would say the issue we're really grappling with is it is completely undecided. No one knows how it's going to shake out. I'm not going to pretend like I do. And so I think you're asking what I'm seeing, it's just this enormous amount of uncertainty among investors in terms of where the market's going to go. And what's happened is a lot of people don't invest because they're just not sure anymore. And so I'm hopeful that will change in the next 6 months. All of that being said, we've invested in a number of companies that are relevant to technology and media, obviously. I would say the most obvious kind of example would be we invested in an influencer marketplace platform called Statosphere. And so the way we sort of bring innovation to Hearst, the way we think about innovating in media is you can imagine Hearst is selling packages to advertisers. Those advertisers are asking, how do we reach consumers today? And we're like, boom, we have this influencer marketplace. This is the way that people advertise today. And so it's not this enormous seismic shift in terms of how Hearst is working or how we're producing content. I would say it's bringing in pieces here and there, similar to Mental Canvas, where we're just changing the way we do things on the margin.
Great. And so, sorry, taking a step back, Julie, maybe you can talk a little bit about your background in education and sort of the fusing of arts and technology in your own trajectory.
Yes, as I mentioned, I actually started out studying architecture, but I was always very interested in math and science when I was in high school. kind of halfway through a professional architecture degree, I stumbled into a computer graphics lab, and I just like a light went off, and I suddenly saw the way to combine my interests in computing and science with my architecture interests. And over the years, I eventually went on and got a PhD in computer science. And over the years, architecture and the arts more broadly have provided a kind of endless source of really challenging problems, like things from cultural heritage, architectural design, kind of simulating really, really complicated scenes. A good friend of mine was a long-term faculty member at the University of Washington in computer science, and he left that to run the research group at Pixar Animation Studios and Disney for about 15 years. And he was always telling me how, there were PhD theses just coming out of all of the challenges that Pixar needed to solve to create a movie. So it's one thing to simulate a few strands of hair, but how do you simulate millions of strands of hair that are moving and that really look like hair, or skin that moves and folds, cloth? All of these things are such challenging technical problems. And really, computer graphics is really about solving those technical problems. There's a lot of physics, there's a lot of computation, machine learning, and on and on. But all of these really hard problems are often inspired by artistic challenges. How can we tell a story? You don't want the story to be taken over by the technology. You want a seamless blend so that the technology's behind, but what you're seeing is really realistic and faithful to the story.
Let's move to commercialization, and it would be great, I think, for everyone to know where you are in the commercialization process and what your learning experiences have been thus far. Maybe some words of wisdom for everyone. You want to start, Lance?
Sure. So we're sort of at the stage where, the product's out there, we have customers, it's just a matter of scaling it out to a much larger audience. But I think, Julie, what you were saying in regard to Pixar as well, of, having the sort of technology fulfill what the artists want, I think that's the big thing that we're trying to look at is how does the technology map onto the work that someone is doing or the artist is doing itself versus the other way around, where we don't want to have someone, well, I have this amazing idea and now I have to actually fit it within this box. It's like, how can we raise what we're doing to meet that? And so really at this stage of commercialization, it's sort of trying to meet the customer's needs, seeing what they're doing, and how can we, a lot of it is a piece of hardware and software, and there's, we're trying to bring that learning curve down. And so it's just a matter of how can we scale this out to a larger audience where, the in-person impression that we get is great. It clicks for them right away. How can you replicate that, in the digital presence where, you are meeting with people on Zoom and you want to be able to move this at a much faster scale?
Julie?
So we're at a point now where we have about 2 million users of the platform, and focusing on particular areas, digital publishing of children's books, trailers, and ads. And I think one of the things that was key for us in getting things out there was social media, engaging artists. And one thing that's been very clear with Mental Canvas is that the creators are our best form of marketing and advertising. And there's this great flywheel effect where a scene will go viral on social media, and then we see this huge uptake of new users. And so that's been tremendously successful. We haven't done any kind of traditional marketing whatsoever. It's all been kind of word of mouth and organic through social media.
And as an investor, sort of where are you in observing this process, guiding?
The process of commercialization. I'm going to try not to bore you all with corporate innovation because it's like all I think about. I think one of the things, as I mentioned, we're consistently thinking about is how can we accelerate a startup's revenue base? And I would say the biggest barrier for startups that we run into is often large corporations are just not ready to work with them for a huge variety of reasons. It can be on the legal side, which we can help cut red tape when it comes to that. But when they talk about startups needing to be 10 times faster or a 10 times improvement, I think that really comes back to people who work at corporations don't want to try new things. They're really not necessarily incentivized to change their workflows. They're not necessarily incentivized to take this enormous risk of, we're going to try this new technology, maybe our readers flee. I think they're much more incentivized to protect against the downside than to think about, I'm a cog in a wheel in a 20,000 person corporation. Like, why am I necessarily helping them grow revenue? So the challenge of the lab and the challenge of working with the founders is you can see the partnership. It's right there. The potential is right there, but getting people on board, I would say the vast majority of my job is not technical. It's pleading with people to give it a chance. But all that said, it's extremely rewarding when it does pay off, and it does. It just takes a little bit longer than I think everyone would generally hope. But we've had some, I would say, really amazing collaborations with our startups that are just, it's so important to thinking about the future of our company. I know I sound like a Hearst corporate advertisement, but I really do love the place I work. And, part of the mission of Hearstlab is to use the innovations and the technology and the brilliance of the founders that we work with to think about how do we keep this centuries-old company still relevant. And so a big thank you to the founders for that. I'm just a facilitator, truthfully.
Lance and Julie, maybe you can share with us the struggles, the lessons learned, the wisdom that you would have for other people running startups, their own startups.
I would say it's just, sticking through the ups and downs of it. It's one of those things where you'll keep, doing something, and all of a sudden you'll start to see those breakthroughs. And I think it's being able to ride through that with your vision and everything. And then as soon as you have customers using it, so we've been, the Museum of Ice Cream has used it. We've had installations at South by Southwest, Sundance, award-winning installation at the Flatiron Plaza. And anytime, someone uses it and they're like, oh, I wasn't able to achieve this, I would say that's the thing that gets you through. And so trying to repeat that process as much as possible where, I think that's the hardest thing of just being able to stick with the problem that you're solving and why you're doing this in the first place and going back to those roots. Because, you go through all these different phases of this where, you're doing cold outreach with sales, you're, in the weeds of the technology. And I think it's being able to just stay with, okay, this is the reason that I'm doing it, and this is why I'm doing it. I would say that's been one of the biggest lessons of just having that tenacity to go with it. Because, you also you'll see all these numbers on LinkedIn and everything of like, oh, I just raised this massive round, or these are the customers. And I think, that can be very, just like any social media, sometimes very disheartening. And I think being able to stay true to yourself, because you're all within your own game and you're all, we're doing hardware. It's a much sort of, it takes a lot longer. You can't, it takes a month anytime we need to change something. Whereas software, you're able to move at these much faster iteration cycles, and just know that you have to see where the market's going, but just you're also playing your own game and just staying true to yourself, I think has been one of the sort of the lessons that has been, great to learn.
Mm-hmm. Julie?
Well, I would definitely agree with Lance that running a startup is not a sprint. It's definitely a marathon, and it takes time and tenacity, and it's not for the faint of heart. So one of the things that, aside from the kind of tenacity and will that it takes, I think also my startup went through the National Science Foundation's Small Business Innovation Program, which is SBIR, which is non-dilutive seed funding for promising technologies. And they put a very strong focus on customer discovery. So especially for someone like me, it's great to spend all this time in the lab thinking up these new ideas. But they really forced us to get out and actually talk to customers. And it's so easy to think you have an idea that will, that has legs and it's going to solve all these problems. But it's another thing to actually get out and talk to customers. And I think Eastin had an excellent point about, in big corporations, they talk about innovation all the time, but they do very little of it actually when it comes down to it, because it involves a lot of risk. So kind of finding customers that are a good fit for the startup, but also willing to take some risk, I think is pretty key, especially in technology.
Mm-hmm. I'm just going to add from the perspective of someone who runs an art startup, and of course it was not my idea, but I have found both at the Schwartzman Center, and I used to run the Wallace Annenberg Center for the Performing Arts in LA for 8 years, which was also a startup, is managing other people's expectations. And both of these entities were so big and so visible. And so I think people's expectations were so high when we started. And I realized when I came in, we never used the spaces. We didn't know the technology in the spaces. We actually didn't have much of a team in place. So managing those expectations. Otherwise, I think you're really prone to failure early on. So I have one more question, and then I'm going to turn to your questions. But I just want to talk about Yale for one moment. And Lance, maybe you can just talk a little bit more in detail about, well, first of all, I would love to know if this idea for your company emerged while you were still a student. And if so, you mentioned Sci-City and some other resources at Yale that maybe were helpful in getting this off the ground. So I would love to hear about that experience. And then, Julie, I really want to hear about the arts and technology major that you foster.
Absolutely. So, so it absolutely came from work that my co-founder also was Yale class of 2020. He's actually coming back for his 5-year in a few days. But with that, was sort of the two main projects that we were working on together here that really inspired what we were doing. The one was a class that was in partnership with the Smithsonian that we then continued through a fellowship to develop a new type of museum navigation device. So how could spaces be more personalized? How can you help people navigate without looking at their phones and be able to save exhibits and have these continued experiences? And then also a grant that we did, that was the Blended Reality grant. And with that, it was how could we create a more accessible AR VR controller? And while we were here, we actually had a brainstorming session with people from the School of Medicine, School of Architecture, School of Forestry, and that was very AR VR focused. And we were like, what would your ideal sort of interface be for these digital worlds? And they had all these amazing ideas. We sort of gave them clay and these other crafting materials, and we have photos, and they're really fascinating of what they created, but they then said, well, there's nothing we can do about this. And so it really came from that experience of, one, being in the weeds of, even with engineering backgrounds, creating all of, custom circuit boards and embedded code and network stacks, and then also seeing there's this much larger audience of people that wanted to develop with hardware and sensor connected experiences. And we're like, what if we could create a platform that would make this a lot easier? And so really having that foundation from Yale and being able to explore ideas in that stage, it was after graduation that we officially founded the company and sort of really start building out the IP. But having that ability to have access to all these amazing professors and even your peers and students, and to be able to have access to the resources and to be able to talk to these people. The fact that we were able to have that brainstorming session with people in all these different disciplines, that wouldn't have happened in any other situation if it wasn't within a research university.
And am I right to say that you also were in the Yale Ballet simultaneously?
Yes. and that even going back to the liberal arts education, having the ability to explore those, and as an undergrad, you're running groups at a small scale, but it gives you that little bit of taste of entrepreneurship and how you're managing a group of people, how you have a little bit of funding from the university, very, very small scale, but it does give you that ability to experiment and play, and even just within the liberal arts side of it, that ability to think and learn how to learn. We're doing things that we didn't necessarily have that we were prepared for, but sort of the background that you're giving of, okay, I know this is a problem I'm unsure of, but I have the skills to be able to navigate it and learn.
I don't want to underestimate small scale, though, because I have worked for many small and mid-sized under-resourced nonprofits, and you have to be so clever, creative, resourceful, efficient. So I'm all for small scale and learning those skills in that capacity. Julie, can we just hear a little bit about the Arts and Technology program? And you mentioned it's 10 years at this point, so tell us more about it.
Yeah, so roughly 10 years ago, we introduced a new major in Yale College called Computing and the Arts. And unlike a kind of a so-called digital arts program, which many of our peers have, where students take a lot of different kinds of courses, our focus is on developing an in-depth introduction to computer science, coupled with a track in one of Yale's 5 major branches of the arts: art, architecture, theater studies, art history, and did I mention music? So the idea is students take half of their major requirements in the computer science department and then half in one of the tracks in those, if they pick an arts discipline. And then in their senior year, they do a year-long senior project, which includes faculty from both disciplines and involves a project that spans those disciplines. And in some ways, this kind of was inspired by my own trajectory, but it's something that I worked with colleagues both in the computer science department and also in the arts disciplines to put together. It's been extraordinarily successful. I think it's particularly timely because the arts, the way education works in the arts is typically through tutorials and a critique model of education, whereas in computer science we do, problem sets and programming assignments. But when you put those two together, you're educating a student who really knows how to think and solve problems from multiple different perspectives. And so students from the major are gone on to traditional big tech like Microsoft, Apple, Google, startups, but also arts museums where they work on the technology side of cultural preservation and things like that. And also just like advertising, creative directors in large advertising firms. So it's been a very broad range of future endeavors or professions. But it's been, I think, a really a success story, and also maybe a model for how education today in the days of AI might be reformed or rethought.
Great. Thank you. We have about 13 minutes for questions, so very happy to take your questions now. Yes.
Should I just, I don't know if there's a microphone or anything.
I'm happy to.
Also, just speak if you can hear me. Thank you for the panel. I wanted to ask a little bit about what you were saying specifically with regards to commercialization before, about how it's, Eastin, the hardest part of your job, you said. As we've been talking about the arts and how you have been able to innovate specifically with how you do work in the creative sense, you have Indistinguishable from Magic and your tool as well. I wanted to know, in the future of work sense, if and how building in this sector specifically act as a sort of bastion or a beacon, especially for companies that may have wider applicability, not just in one specific narrow vertical. So is there any benefit, in other words, to having companies be built in the media space with all its publicity, in terms of how you would kind of accelerate or aid in the commercialization process? Is a question.
You want me to start? I'll start. I guess the first thing I realized when I joined Hearstlab, I had never worked for that large of a corporate, and I truthfully never worked with startups. And so there were many founders with amazing ideas, particularly around media, creating new media. And then what I quickly learned was sort of the downfall was they didn't really understand how media makes money. So I'll make it very simple. You want to sell to advertisers. That is the beginning and the end. That is where all the money in media companies really comes from. We have some founders, I would say, in the media sector who are we have a company that's doing Gen AI press releases of all things, and so they're selling more to startups and individual businesses. But when I think about the direction that all startups tend to converge on in the media space, eventually, sometimes it takes 3 months, sometimes it takes 3 years to realize. At some point, the advertisers have the monies, and you can sell directly to brands, but generally brands are represented by agencies. And so whatever the startup is, if you want to get large-scale venture funding and you want to be large-scale commercially successful, then you're going to have to address that segment. All of that said, one of the tricky pieces to being another tricky piece to being a startup in the media space is VC loves to see reoccurring revenue. Media is not reoccurring. It's very bulky. You advertise a bunch and say Q1 instead of Q2. And so it's another kind of layer of difficulty when it comes to being a startup in the media sector. But the short answer is you have to figure out how to sell to agencies or directly to brands. Does that answer your question?
No.
Yes, here, let me...
Oh, it's okay, I'm
give you the
loud.
mic. Okay, great.
I'm Ben Hope with Ironton Playhouse. And obviously as startups, you have to be concerned with your revenue, and as nonprofit arts organizations, we have to be concerned with our expenses. And do you consider ways to lower your paywall so that organizations that don't have a ton of resources can access your products? Where we're not maybe on the cutting edge of innovation, we do need to update our tech and innovate ourselves using the new products? And can you maybe speak to whether or not you can make your products accessible to people who have to be overly concerned with their expenses?
Yeah, so at Mental Canvas, we have a lot of outreach to educational institutions, but also a range of different nonprofits, and we usually offer special pricing because sometimes some of the most interesting work is being done in nonprofits.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Lance?
Similarly, we have educational pricing, but then also, we never want to have the pricing be limiting someone's idea on it. So we definitely work with people to make sure that if they have an idea, it's not, well, you can't do this because of, the pricing on it. So, we will work with people individually to lower that barrier to entry and have special pricing with it and everything.
Great. Thank you for that. That's awesome.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't want to shout. Thank you. Yeah, I actually have a question that piggybacks a little bit on that, and I think, Julie, you spoke to momentarily. I would love to understand the value that you see today in enabling artists or other types of creators more broadly to experiment with your products. I think that, in the US, we have a history of companies like AT&T Bell inviting artists into their facilities to experiment with mainframe computers and do some of the first rounds of, digital drawing. But that is something that was occurring mid-century. And so here we are 70 years later. I would love to understand what is the value of allowing artists to perhaps experiment and expand use cases, and if you feel like that is perhaps a low risk or a high risk situation, just kind of understand how palatable that is and what some of the benefits are, and if it's something that could be expanded into a larger program.
We continue to make Mental Canvas free and available, actually full features. There are some limitations in terms of how you can export and so on with a watermark, but we definitely value getting new users. We learn from users, getting them onto the platform. And one of our first investors, Alistair Mitchell, who's at EQT, and he's now got his own fund. He always says to me, it's all about the users. Like, you want a lot of users, and then you can figure out kind of exactly what you're going to do with this later, but you want a lot of people on your platform, and we've continued to emphasize that philosophy.